Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. We finished off the last track with three ahadith pertaining to the ihdaad, or the mourning period. So now let us talk about this ihdaad. And we say that when it comes to the woman, she's only allowed to mourn for 3 days and nights for anyone who has died from her family. Except for the husband, she does it for 4 months and 10 days. And so this mourning period is a state of sadness, which is natural, of course, it's to be expected. And in this time, she's going to refrain from certain things which would ordinarily be allowed for her. And these narrations mention a few things. So we say, if the father of a woman dies, then it is permissible for her to be in a state of mourning for at most 3 days and nights. But it is not permissible to do it for more than that. Whereas with the husband, it is 4 months and 10 days. Clearly we can see that the husband has more rights over the woman than the father. And this mourning issue is an illustration of this fact, that the husband does have more rights over the woman than even the father. And the word ihdaad comes from had, which means a limit or a restriction. So it is when the woman limits or restricts herself in certain ways. So she stays in the house, for example, and she does not do certain other things which she is allowed to do normally. As for the ruling on the ihdaad for the husband, then it is wajib, whereas for anyone else, at best it is permissible, but if she did not do it, there's no harm on her. When it comes to the husband, it is wajib. And the evidence for this, Allah Jalla wa Ala says, وَالَّذِينَ يُتَوَفَّوْنَ مِنْكُمْ وَيَذَرُونَ أَزْوَاجًا يَتَرَبَّصْنَ بِأَنفُسِهِنَّ أَرْبَعَةَ أَشْهُرٍ وَعَشْرًا فَإِذَا بَلَغْنَ أَجَلَهُنَّ فَلَا جُنَاحَ عَلَيْكُمْ فِيمَا فَعَلْنَ فِي أَنفُسِهِنَّ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ. And those who die and leave behind wives, then they shall wait for 4 months and 10 days. And when this period has expired, then there is no sin upon you that these women should do whatever they want with themselves. So it means that they can do what they want with themselves after the ihdaad period. But during the ihdaad, or the mourning period, it means that they are not allowed to do with themselves whatever they want. And so this is the had, this is the limit, that they are restricted in this period. And we'll discuss what some of these restrictions are. In the days of Jahiliyyah, there also used to be an ihdaad, but it was different. The woman would stay for 1 year, not 4 months and 10 days, but 1 year in a dirty place, not cleaning herself, so in dirty physical conditions. And then at the end of the year, she would sacrifice a bird or a chicken and smear blood on her, and then she would take a dung of an animal and throw it, so as to say that this 1 year which has passed is valueless, just like the value of this dung. And so on one occasion, and this is mentioned in the narration which we have quoted, that a woman came and she said that the husband of her daughter has died and she's complaining of an eye problem, so can we put kuhl on her eye? And the Prophet said no. And this seemed to be harsh, but he justified it by saying that one of you would spend 1 year in the ihdaad period and then they would throw a dung. So be grateful for the fact that Islam has reduced this to only 4 months and 10 days. So until then, keep patient. And the reason why the Prophet did not allow the kuhl, because it is not from the medication. There is no guarantee, or it is not likely that it will cure the eye. But when it comes to genuine medication, then we do not say that this is not permitted for the woman to take. So we say that in this ihdaad period, the woman does not adorn herself, and neither does she put on any perfume, and she does not dress in a way which could attract a suitor if a man came to propose to her, and it would make him desirous of her. So she needs to dress in a non-attractive way. And this is from the great rights that the husband has over the wife, that even after he dies, the wife must do this by way of obligation. And when it comes to the Prophet passing away, then he had the greatest right, because his wives were continuously in the ihdaad period, so they were not allowed to marry anyone ever again. So it wasn't a case of 4 months and 10 days, it was a case of forever on until your death. And so this is the great right the Prophet has over the wives. Of course, there's a massive payoff for the wives of the Prophet in this, because we know from the hadith that a woman would be in Jannah, if she does go to Jannah, with her last husband, assuming that both of them will be in Jannah. So if a woman marries husband 1, then afterwards they divorce, or perhaps he dies, and then she marries husband 2, then if all of them are going to be in Jannah, meaning all 3 of them, then the woman will be with husband number 2, because that was the last husband. So this basically means that because the al-Mu'mineen did not remarry, then they will be in Jannah with the Prophet. And surely this is the best person to be in Jannah with, and they will be enjoying the highest status in Jannah. So you can see that for this sacrifice which the mothers of the believers made, in that they did not remarry, there is a more than satisfactory payoff. Is the woman allowed to wear coloured contact lenses in this ihdaad period? Well, the point is, this is also from the adornment, so she is not allowed to do this. She is also not allowed to wear perfume, as is clearly stated in the hadith, وَلَا تَمَسُّ طِيبًا. She does not touch perfume except when she menstruates, because with the menstrual blood it has a stronger stench to it, so you can use this light perfume just to get rid of this smell. So a permission is given here, but in normal cases she's not allowed to put on the perfume. She is allowed to clean herself and take a bath, which of course opposes the ihdaad or the jahiliyyah. So this is not from the adornment which we are talking about, taking a bath. Is she allowed to use soap which is perfumed? This is a similar situation which comes up in the Hajj, because you're not allowed to put perfume on. So here you're not allowed to put perfume on either in the ihdaad. Well, we say that if the soap has a naturally good smell, then this does not harm. But if the soap is deliberately perfumed from an external perfume, then this would be the same as you putting on perfume. So hence that would not be allowed. But as for the natural smell which a perfume has, and this is allowed. For example, you might be eating something which has a naturally good smell. So does this mean that you're putting on perfume? No, it doesn't. It's just a naturally good smell which comes onto you because of the food that you're eating. It's not like you're putting on an external perfume. Notice in the hadith of Salama, the Prophet did allow her to put on this sabir, which is this juice, as a form of medication on her eyes. So you are allowed to take medication, even if it does have something of a color effect, because you're not allowed to put on this sort of coloring and all other types of dye, because this is from the beautification. But when it comes to the medication purposes, in this case putting on this medication on your eye, even though it does have a glow and a color to it, then this is allowed, but by night time, because the night time is when you are more concealed, and you have to take it off by daytime. Notice he did not allow the kuhl to be put on, because the kuhl is not a medication, and it is not likely that it will lead to the healing of the eye, as opposed to the narration of Salama. She was using sabir, and that is a genuine medication. An extreme opinion held by Ibn Hazm is that she's not allowed to put kuhl on her eye, even if she becomes blind. Well, the point is that we don't want anybody to become blind, so if they have a problem with the eye, then of course they're allowed to seek medication. Even if this medication does beautify the eye somewhat, we say, do it by night time, but take it off by daytime. In the first narration, we said that in a wording in the Sunan, it says that the woman is not allowed to comb her hair. But in the narration of Salama, the Prophet told her not to comb your hair with perfume. So you have perfume on the comb, and this will obviously leave a color or a dye on your hair, and that goes against the ihdaad. And so she asked, what should I comb my hair with? And the Prophet said, with sidr, because the sidr would not leave the coloring on the head. So we say that it is permissible for the woman to comb her hair, but it needs to be without the perfume, because in those days women could comb their hair with perfume so as to leave a coloring on the head. So it is this type of combing which is not allowed. As for normal combing, then there's no problem with that. And the reason why we say this, and we do not take the generality of the first wording, is because the narration of Salama gives us more information than the first narration. So we would go with the narration which gives us more information. And this is the rule which we need to follow, that if there's a clash between two narrations, one gives us more information, one gives us less, then we go with the one which gives us more. From the kuhl narration, we can also take that Allah has not made the shifa or the healing in that which is haram. Because if there was shifa, then this would be something beneficial, and if it is beneficial, it would not be haram. Of course, when it comes to the ihdaad, we have said previously that for the pregnant woman, it is not necessarily 4 months and 10 days, it is when she delivers the load. And it also needs to be noted that the ihdaad only applies to the woman, firstly, who is not pregnant, and then secondly, it needs to be in a valid nikah contract. So if you realize that the nikah contract you are in is in fact invalid and the husband has died, then in this case, the woman who believes this nikah contract to be invalid does not need to wait for the 4 months and 10 days. But this ruling does depend on the fiqh opinion which a person holds. So if a person holds that the nikah is valid, then she would have to wait for the 4 months and 10 days. If she believes in accordance with her fiqh that the nikah is invalid, then she does not need to wait for 4 months and 10 days. Because the point is that in an invalid nikah contract, she is not officially his wife. And the ihdaad is only for the wife. As the ayah clearly mentions, those of you who die and leave behind wives, then they wait for 4 months and 10 days. And so likewise, she does not inherit from him either, because the inheritance is only for the proper wife. Allah Jalla wa Ala says, وَلَكُمْ نِصْفُ مَا تَرَكَ أَزْوَاجُكُمْ. You men will have half of what your wives leave behind. So the wife inherits and she is inherited from, but only in a valid nikah contract, because only then she is a zawj or a wife. So we need to look at the sharia in order to decide what is correct and incorrect. For example, if somebody takes an oath and he says, I will not sell anything, and then he goes and sells cigarettes or a bottle of wine. Question is, has he broken the oath? The answer is no, he hasn't, because many people would say, surely he has sold something, has he not? So therefore he's broken the oath. He sold a packet of cigarettes or he sold a bottle of wine. But we say no, he has not broken the oath, because in the Sharia, this is not a sales contract. And its presence is like its absence, because when you sell something which is haram in and of itself, then its presence is like its absence. So it is an invalid sales contract. So the Sharia does not recognize this to be a sales contract, hence he has not broken the oath. So you can see the difference between what people deem to be correct and what the Sharia deems to be correct. What about a dhimmiya woman? So this would be the Jew or a Christian woman who has married a Muslim man in an Islamic state, and the Muslim man dies. Does she have to observe the 4 months and 10 days? Well, if we look at the narration, the Prophet says, لا يحل لامرأة تؤمن بالله واليوم الآخر أن تحد على ميت إلا على زوج. This is a wording in the Sahihain. It mentions that it is not halal for a woman who has iman in Allah and the last day to be in the ihdaad. So the point here is that the Prophet mentions a woman who believes in Allah and the last day, but of course the dhimmiya woman does not believe in Allah and the last day. And so because of this, some scholars have said that if she is a kitabiyya, then she does not have to observe the ihdaad. And they also say that the kuffar are not obliged to follow the detailed laws of the Sharia until they actually become Muslim first. But we say that no, this is wrong. They are obliged to follow the laws of the Sharia, and they will be taken to account for not following these laws in the hereafter. But of course, first they do have to convert to Islam. As for the hadith, which specifically mentions the woman who has iman in Allah in the last day, then this is not a condition. In other words, that is a condition that she should have iman in Allah in the last day for the ihdaad to be obligatory upon her. Rather, we say, when the Prophet mentions iman in Allah in the last day, then this is by means of encouragement, that if you truly believe in Allah in the last day, then you will observe this practice of the ihdaad. Similarly, how the Prophet said that it is not halal for a woman who has iman in Allah in the last day to travel except with a mahram. This is encouraging the Muslim woman that if you truly believe in Allah in the last day, then you will not travel except with a mahram. So based upon this, we say it is not a condition that she should be Muslim, rather it is a condition that she should be a proper wife in a valid nikah contract. So even if she is a kafira, she would still need to observe the ihdaad, as long as she is a valid wife in a valid nikah contract. And of course, that she is not pregnant, because then the waiting period would be until she delivers the load. And also, if this wife is a servant woman, then the same ruling applies, that she has to observe the ihdaad, because she is the wife, and this ruling applies to all wives, free or servant. What about if this wife is ba'in, or completely separated? This could either be through a third divorce, or through the annulment of the marriage, or through the khulu'. Some scholars say that this is wajib even on these types of women as well. because they say with these types of women they have to observe the iddah period of the 3 quru. And this is the opinion of the Hanbali scholars, as we mentioned. So they say if this is the case, then they also have to observe the ihdaad if the man dies. Other scholars have said it is not wajib upon them, at best it is permissible. What is certainly correct is that it is not wajib upon her because she is not the wife. But these scholars also say it is permissible for her. However, to that we say, it doesn't seem to be clear why it is permissible. So there doesn't seem to be any proper good grounds to say that it is permissible for her to do so, because there is simply no relation between her and the husband anymore. What about the wife who is in the iddah period of the raj'i divorce? So she's in the iddah period of the raj'i divorce. Some scholars say that the ihdaad is not wajib on this type of woman, and that what is wajib is that she should wait out the iddah period of the 3 menstrual cycles. They say at best it is permissible for her to do that, but not wajib, because they say that the iddah period is in fact the ihdaad here. And they take the evidence from the ayah of the Quran, لا تخرجوهن من بيوتهن ولا يخرجن إلا أن يأتين بفاحشة مبينة. So Allah says with regards to the divorced women, do not take them out of your houses, and they should not leave the house except if they perform an open immoral sin, like zina. So they say that this is in fact the ihdaad, because in the ihdaad, the woman stays in the home. So she is in fact performing the ihdaad of the 3 menstrual cycles, not of the 4 months and 10 days. However, we argue back by saying that this ayah is not referring at all to the ihdaad. The reason why Allah says that she should not leave the house, or that you are not allowed to take her out of your house, is because when she's in the waiting period, she should perform this waiting period in the house of the husband. But this does not mean to say that she's not allowed to leave the house, in the same way that the muhiddah, or the woman in the ihdaad, is not allowed to leave the house, except for case of necessity. Rather, we say that the woman in the iddah period is allowed to leave the house and do whatever she wants to do, just as normal. Allah is just commanding her that because you've divorced her in a raj'i divorce, you are not permitted to kick her out of the house, except if they commit zina. But when it comes to the ihdaad, the matter is much more serious, and the restriction is greater. So that ayah in Surah At-Talaq is not talking about the ihdaad, it is talking about the iddah. And so the ihdaad is something completely different. So we say in a case like this, if she's in an iddah period and the husband dies during the iddah period, then she will observe the 4 months and 10 days from the time the husband dies. So in other words, her iddah period will change. Just remember that the woman in the raj'i divorce is still officially the wife of the husband. So he does have to spend on her, and if one of them dies, they would inherit from each other. What about a woman who has intercourse with a man in the wad'u shubha? So she thought that this is halal intercourse, but in fact it is not. Or perhaps even a case of zina. If the man dies, then she does not need to observe the ihdaad because she is not the proper wife of this man, both in the case of zina and the wad'u shubha. Remember, we said that the wad'u shubha can be of 2 types. One is the i'tiqad, or the belief, and one is the shubhatul aqd, when you think that the marriage contract is valid, whereas in fact it turns out that it is invalid. For example, both of you are brothers and sisters through breastfeeding. And so we say that in this ihdaad period, she does not put on any nail polish or nail varnish, any dye, and anything that might beautify her. This also includes the hinna, and this also includes jewelry. But upon this then, we ask ourselves the question, if she was wearing this jewelry when the husband dies, and then she of course enters into the ihdaad period, do we say that it is obligatory upon you to take off this jewelry? Or do we say no, you can keep this jewelry on because when you put this jewelry on, it was halal for you to do it. And now that your husband has died, you have not actually put on any jewelry, rather you are continuing on with the jewelry which was halal for you to be put on at that time. For example, a person in a state of ihram is not allowed to put on perfume. However, if before the state of ihram, he puts on the perfume on his face, let's say, on his body, not on the clothing of course, and then after he enters into a state of ihram, does he have to take the perfume off? We say no, he does not have to take the perfume off. In fact, the Prophet would put on perfume before he entered into the state of ihram, and he did not take it off, because we say that the continuation is stronger than the beginning. So what's happening here is that you're continuing on with the perfume, and so this is permissible, but what you're not allowed to do is to begin to put on the perfume when you're in the state of ihram. This is what we mean, that the continuation is stronger than the beginning. So likewise here, she is continuing on to put this jewelry. She's not beginning to put the jewelry on in the state of ihdaad. So which option do we go for then? Do we say it is obligatory upon you to take it off? Or do we say that the continuation is stronger than the initiation? In this case, we say because the ihdaad is the right of another person, in this case the husband, he deserves the right that the woman does not put on the jewelry. So in a case like this, it would be better for us to say, take it off. As for the qa'idah, that the continuation is stronger than the initiation, certainly this is a qa'idah, but in this case, because the right not just of Allah, but of another human being is at stake, we would order her to take off the jewelry, whether it be the bracelet or the earring or whatever, because this is the right that another person has over her. Some scholars have said that she does not wear the niqab. Why do they say that? They take it from an analogy that in the ihram she's not allowed to wear the niqab. That's of course a sacred state, so the ihdaad is also a sacred state and she's not allowed to wear the niqab. So they pass this ruling by way of analogy. So is this analogy correct? We say no, this analogy is not correct. You cannot make an analogy between the ihdaad and the ihram. So you cannot say that in the ihdaad she's not allowed to wear the niqab nor the gloves, whereas in the ihram she's not allowed to wear the niqab nor the gloves, because these are two different states. Sure, they're both sacred states, however they are sufficiently different. So for example, in the ihram she's not allowed to hunt game animals, whereas in the ihdaad she is allowed to hunt game animals. But in the ihram she is allowed to put on jewelry, but in the ihdaad she's not allowed to put on jewelry. So these are two clear differences. In the ihram, she is allowed to wear some nice clothing, but in the ihdaad, she is not allowed to wear the nice clothing. So in the ihram, she can wear good quality and beautiful clothing, but in the ihdaad, she doesn't. In the ihram, she is not allowed to clip the nails, nor is she allowed to cut the hair. But in the ihdaad, she is allowed to clip the nails and she is allowed to cut the hair. One thing they do have in common is that you're not allowed to put on perfume. That's fair enough. However, the ihram and the ihdaad differ in many issues, so you cannot make this analogy. As for what constitutes beautiful clothing, then this will be decided by the customs of the people. But here's a question though. Is the woman in the ihdaad, meaning the muhiddah, is she allowed to wear beautiful clothing underneath the normal or non-beautiful clothing so that it doesn't show up? Some scholars have said yes, she can, but it appears to us the safer option would be no, she cannot, just in case it becomes uncovered and it does show. Also, nowadays we could have this idea that the women in the ihdaad, they specifically wear black clothing. Well, there's no evidence for this. So for somebody to have this idea that this is the sunnah, then we say no, this is wrong. Rather, the sunnah is just not to wear any beautiful clothing. And you find women doing many other things, like in some countries the woman in the ihdaad might not look at the full moon because the full moon is a man, in accordance with their beliefs. So these are all baseless beliefs and practices. Or for example, you could have the woman in the ihdaad not going up to the roof of the house. Again, completely baseless. And in many countries we have this idea that the women will gather together on the 40th day of the death of the husband and recite the Quran and commemorate his death. And again, this is all baseless, and people are going to start believing that this is from the Sunnah, and practices like this actually destroy the Sunnah, let alone revive the Sunnah. So the word needs to go out that these are baseless practices and must be abandoned. So what about this question of where does the woman stay during the iddah period when the husband dies? Well, we say it is wajib upon her to stay in the house in which she was living in with the husband. So it is not necessarily the place where the husband died. So for example, the husband might have died in the hospital. Does this now mean that the wife remains in the iddah period in the hospital? The answer is no, it would be in the husband's house. So the general principle is she stays in that house and she does not leave for 4 months and 10 days. However, there are instances in which she is allowed to leave. For example, if she is staying in a place in which she fears that there might be a break-in, because many people in the area are those who don't fear Allah and they might break in the house and attack her. Well, we know that this situation did happen during the time of the Prophet, in which a woman did fear that she might be broken into, and we'll discuss that narration as it's coming up. And the Prophet ﷺ allowed her to move. So we say in a case like this, in which there is a genuine fear, then she's allowed to move. But if she does move, then some scholars have said that she has to move to the closest house possible to the house of the husband. But we say no, she can move to absolutely any house she wants to, even if it is far away, because the obligation is to stay in the house of the husband. Now, if she cannot stay in the house of the husband, we do not say that you have to stay in the closest possible house, because all other houses now are equal with regards to her staying in them. They have equal rights, if you like. For example, if a man has to make wudu and he has to wash his arms up to the elbow, but let's say his forearms are chopped off. So what do we say to him then? Does he have to wash his arms? Of course, this is impossible, he cannot do so. But do we tell him, okay then, just wash the upper arms? The answer is no, you don't wash the upper arms. In fact, you do nothing at all, because the obligation was pertaining to the forearms up to the elbows. But of course, this man doesn't have any forearms, so therefore he does not need to wash anything. Same way, when you shave your head after the ihram, if a person is naturally bald, what do we say to him? Because some scholars have said that he simply passes a razor over his head, because this is the closest thing he can do to shaving the head. But we say no, this is completely futile. The obligation is about shaving the head. Now if he cannot do that, then there is nothing more for you to do. So similarly here, the obligation is to stay in the husband's house. Now if she cannot do this, then the obligation is waived and she can stay in any other house. Or it could be that she is forced out of the house, because let's say they were living in a house in which the husband was paying rent. Now the husband dies, he cannot pay the rent anymore and she does not have the money, so the owner forces them out. So in a case like this, she would just simply spend her iddah period in any other house which is possible for her to stay in. But what about if she's staying in the husband's house? Is she allowed to leave the house by daytime? We say that she is allowed to leave the house by daytime for a genuine need, for example shopping. But she's not allowed to leave the house by nighttime even for a genuine need like shopping. Rather, the only case in which she can leave by nighttime would be in a case of darura, or that which is necessary and cannot be avoided. So for example, can she leave the house by daytime to go for a stroll in the park, or just for some leisure activity? The answer is no. This is not a haja, a need. But shopping, for example, is a haja, so therefore this is allowed. But by night time, not even shopping. For example, you could be living at a time or a place in which the houses are weakly built, and let's say the rain is pouring down hard, and she fears that the roof might collapse in. So here she can leave by night time. What about this situation? That she disobeys the rules of the ihdaad, so she does dress up in adorned clothing, she puts on makeup or perfume, and she does not observe the rules of the ihdaad during the 4 months and 10 days. Well, we say that after the 4 months and 10 days expire, then she is allowed to remarry, because the iddah period has expired, but she is sinful for not observing these rules. And we simply say it is upon her to do what every sinful person should do, which is to make sincere tawbah. And Allah Jalla wa Ala forgives all sins. So let's just recap a few basic issues with regards to the ihdaad. We say the ihdaad, with all its rulings, is permissible for anyone who is not a husband, but it is haram to do so for more than 3 days. And for the husband, it is wajib, not only wajib, but it needs to be wajib for 4 months and 10 days. And this clearly shows us the difference in rights that the husband has and the rights which the other relatives have over this woman. The rights of the husband are truly great. And this is not the right which the husband has given himself. Of course, the husband cannot give himself any rights whatsoever. Any rights which we do have, either for us or against us, are dictated by Allah Jalla wa Ala, who is, of course, the all-knowing and the all-wise, which puts him in the best position to be giving out the rights. and we have given the evidences which prove that the woman needs to stay in the iddah period of 4 months and 10 days. This is of course as long as she is not pregnant, because there we also have the evidence that her iddah, even if the husband dies, would be until she delivers the load, and we discussed the narration there. During the ihdaad, she needs to avoid anything that will beautify her, and this includes beautiful clothes, perfume, and types of color or dye. And as for combing the hair, this is allowed as long as it is not done with a dye. Kuhl cannot be put on, of course. If you have to put on something on the eye for medication purposes and it gives the eye a glow, then we know that this is permissible, but by night time. As for the perfume, then it is permissible if she uses a perfume which does not have a strong smell, and this would be after the menses, just to remove the stench of the menses blood. And we also oppose the issue of the Jahiliyyah in that the muhidda is not prevented in the Sharia from cleaning herself. Of course she should clean herself. It's the adornment which is prohibited. Is it allowed for the muhidda to speak to non-mahram men during her iddah period? The answer is yes, as long as this does not entail anything haram like her softening the voice or her adorning herself. And of course the non-mahram men need to lower their gaze and they must not look at this woman. And remember, this ihdaad is wajib upon the woman whether she has entered into privacy with the husband or not. And it does not depend either on the age, and neither does it depend on the deen, because as long as she is a wife, even if she is a Christian or a Jew, as long as she is a valid wife in a valid nikah contract, then she has to observe this iddah period. And this is the majority opinion on this issue. Otherwise, some scholars have said that a Christian or a Jewish wife does not need to observe this iddah, because these laws of al-Islam do not apply to the Jews and Christians. Hadith 965 وعن جابر رضي الله عنه قال طلقت خالتي فأرادت أن تجد نخلها فزجرها رجل أن تخرج فأتت النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فقال بل جدي نخلك فإنك عسى أن تصدقي أو تفعلي معروفا. رواه مسلم. From Jabir, he says that my maternal aunt, her husband, she was divorced, and so obviously she was in the iddah period then, and she wanted to go out and cut the fruits of the date palm tree, and so a man forbade her from doing so, meaning forbade her from going out of the house because she was in the iddah period. And so she went to the Prophet to ask him about this, and the Prophet said, no, rather go out and cut the fruits of the date palm tree, because it could be that with these fruits you will give charity or that you will do something which is good. The principle with regards to the woman in the iddah period when she has been divorced is that she can go in and out of the house, and there's no problem with that. When the Quran tells us that she should not leave the house or that you should not drive her out of the house, as we have recited in Surah Al-Talaq, then it means that the husband is not allowed to kick her out of the house simply because she is divorced now. No, rather, she has every right to remain in the house for the iddah period, as long as this is a revocable divorce, of course. And the point is that the wife in the iddah, she is treated just like any other normal wife, as long as this divorce is a raj'i divorce. But the Quran does give permission that you're allowed to kick her out of the house if she comes with a fahisha, and this would be if she speaks extremely rudely to the husband without any respect. And so we take from this that there is no problem in the wife, or the woman for that matter, to be cutting off the dates from the date palm tree, and also no problem in her giving charity from her wealth, even if the husband does not know about this. As long as she's giving charity from her wealth, then she's free to do this. As for the narration which talks about the fact that she's not allowed to do anything with the money except by the permission of the husband, then the scholars understand this to be pertaining to a woman who is not Rashida. So she is not able to spend her money wisely. So the point is, she is in the custody or the guardianship of her husband, and so she needs to seek permission first, because she might be making a terrible decision with her money. But as for if she is of sound mind and she knows how to spend the money wisely, then there is no problem in her giving charity even without the knowledge of the husband. But as for the muhidda, then the case is much more strict, because she is not allowed to leave the house except for a case of a genuine need, and by night time she can only leave the house in a case of necessity. So the situation is much more strict for the muhidda than it is simply for the mu'tadda. When the woman spends the iddah period after a divorce, then in this iddah period she is serving 4 rights. Firstly, the right of Allah, in that she is obeying the command which Allah has set down on her. Secondly, the right of the husband, in that it shows that she respects this marriage contract and that it is a serious and grave contract, and it gives the husband an opportunity to take her back and so that they can be together again. It could be the case that the husband regrets making this divorce decision, as can often be the case. And it is also her right as well, because it is far better for her to stay with this husband than to become a woman who is divorced and then she loses her value, because other men may not be so enthusiastic then to marry her. So this iddah period actually serves her interest as well. And then fourthly, we have the right of the child, because with the iddah period she can then decide whether she's pregnant or not, and then the child will be attributed to the appropriate man. Whereas if after the divorce she immediately marries again and consummates the marriage and she is pregnant, then we may not know who the father is. Well, certainly in the olden days this would be the case. Nowadays we do have DNA testing, but in the olden days there would be no way of telling, or at least it would be extremely difficult to tell, and certainly on a societal level it will cause much confusion, and so the child may not know who the father is. And so every child has the right to know who his or her father is. So the iddah period does serve the interest and the rights of the child, if there is a child in the womb of the woman. So we simply say that the woman in the iddah period, if it is a raj'i divorce, then she spends the iddah in the husband's house. So she's not allowed to leave the husband's house and spend the iddah somewhere else, and there is no problem with her going out to fulfill her needs, such as in this case she went out to pick the fruits, meaning the dates, from the date palm tree. Also we take from this hadith the good character of the maternal aunt of Jabir, in that she went and sought a fatwa, so she was eager for knowledge. She did not just make taqleed on this man and simply believe him when he told her that you're not allowed to leave the house. So she didn't just blind follow this man, she went out and investigated the issue, and this is the character of the Muslim. He doesn't just accept anyone's word who speaks about the deen. Rather, he goes out and he studies and he investigates the issue. So we can also use this hadith as evidence that you do not just take anyone's word on face value without any evidence. Rather, we say evidence is always top priority. Doesn't matter how big the sheikh is or how knowledgeable he is. As long as he's not speaking with evidence, then you have every right to reject what he's saying. He needs to provide some sort of evidence, or at least some kind of justification, because it's not always that you have evidences from the Quran and the Sunnah for absolutely every single issue you speak about. Sometimes you have to justify your ruling, because you may not have a direct quote from the Quran or the Hadith. So the point is, there must be some sort of backing to what you are saying when you speak about al-Islam. Hadith number 966, from Furay'ah bint Malik radiyallahu anha, she says that 2 servants of her husband escaped, they ran away, and so the husband left the house to see where they are. He chased after them, and it so happened that these 2 servants killed him. And so Furay'ah asked the Prophet whether she can return to her family, and the reason is because her husband did not leave any house which he owned, and neither did he leave any expenditure which she could make use of. And so then the Prophet told her yes, she's allowed to leave, and she says that when I was in the room, he called me back and he said, "Umkuthi fi baytiki hatta yablugha al-kitabu ajalah." Wait in your house, meaning the house of the husband, until the iddah reaches its appointed term. And so she says that I made the iddah period in the husband's house for 4 months and 10 days. And she says that after the Prophet, Uthman gave the same ruling. This narration in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad and in the 4 Sunan is Sahih. Hadith 967, وعن فاطمة بنت قيس رضي الله عنها قالت: قلت يا رسول الله إن زوجي طلقني 3 وأخاف أن يقتحم علي فأمرها فتحولت. رواه Muslim. From Fatima bint Qais, she says to the Prophet that my husband has divorced me 3 times, and I fear that in the house in which I'm spending the iddah period, somebody might break in, and so the Prophet ordered her to move houses. Muslim reported this. So both of these narrations talk about where the woman in the iddah spends the iddah. So in the first narration, this woman's husband died, and so she had to spend the iddah period, which is the ihdaad in this case, in the husband's home. And here, in the second narration, she's not spending the iddah in the husband's home because she's divorced 3 times, so she is no longer his wife, but she's spending the iddah in another house. But she is allowed to leave the house because she fears that somebody might break in. Well, we take from the first narration then that a man should not put himself unnecessarily in danger, because here he is chasing after the 2 servants who have run away. The servants have run away for a good reason. They probably hate the master. So now if the master goes looking for them, and he is 1, they are 2, then they will outnumber him and they'll fancy their chances to kill him. So here we find that the master has put himself unnecessarily in danger, and this is not what the Muslim should be doing. Do not put yourself in danger unnecessarily. The woman then is spending the ihdaad in the husband's house. Where is she receiving the expenditure from? Because she says that he has not left any expenditure. Well, we say she must have taken it from the inheritance money of the husband. We also find in this first narration that the Prophet gave a ruling based on his own ijtihad, not based on the wahi. And the reason is because he changed his mind. Now, if this was a wahi directly from Allah, then he would not have changed his mind. So we say that the Prophet sometimes can give a ruling based on his own ijtihad. Because firstly, he allowed her to spend the ihdaad in the family's house, but then he changed his mind. He said, no, you have to do it in the husband's house. So we say that this final decision which he gave, meaning that the woman needs to spend the ihdaad in the husband's house, is in fact the decision of Allah. And the way we can say this is because Allah Jalla wa Ala did not send down a revelation telling the Prophet he's wrong. And so Allah has given his silent approval to this decision of the Prophet. Therefore we say that this decision of the Prophet is in fact wahi from Allah. But it is not like a proactive wahi in which he sends down the revelation. Rather, it is a wahi in terms of Allah giving his silent approval. Otherwise, if the Prophet does do something wrong, then we have quoted examples from the Quran in which Allah Jalla wa Ala does correct the Prophet. For example, when he tells the Prophet, عَفَى اللَّهُ عَنْكَ لِمَا أَذِنْتَ لَهُمْ حَتَّى يَتَبَيَّنَ لَكَ الَّذِينَ صَدَقُوا وَتَعْلَمَ الْكَاذِبِينَ. May Allah forgive you. Why did you allow them to keep away from the battle until you knew who was telling you the truth, meaning the genuine excuses, and who was lying? And we have plenty of other examples as well in the Quran in which Allah did not approve of the decision of the Prophet ﷺ. But this is the difference between our ijtihad and the Prophet's ijtihad. If we make a mistake in our ijtihad, Allah is not going to send down a wahi telling us that we're wrong. And the second difference is that if Allah keeps quiet over our ijtihad, it does not mean that Allah approves of it. Whereas this is the case in the ijtihad of the Prophet. So notice these differences. We also take from this narration that it is permissible to accept the news item of 1 woman, and we do not say that you need to bring a second woman, because here Furay'a in the first narration and Fatima bint Qais in the second narration are narrating something to us, and each of these women is just 1 woman. So we do not say that you have to bring another woman for your testimony. Rather, when it comes to these news items pertaining to the deen, not financial disputes, but these news items pertaining to the deen, then even the statement of 1 woman is to be accepted. And so in a case like this, the men and women are equal. We learn that Fatima bint Qais was divorced 3 times, and we know that the woman who has been divorced 3 times, she does not have the right that the husband should provide for her financially, and neither to give her a place to live, to spend the iddah period, because she is completely separated and hence she is an ajnabiyya woman. We also take from the second narration that evil and corruption was present even during the time of the Prophet, and that it's impossible to get rid of evil and corruption completely from any society. And we know this because Fatima says that I fear that I will be broken into. So even though this sort of evil and corruption was present, but during the time of the Sahaba, it was the least. Nowadays, it is very great. What about if the husband dies and the woman is pregnant? Then of course we know she deserves expenditure for her. But where does this money come from? We say that this money comes from the inheritance money of the child. So the money which the child is going to inherit, it is taken from that, because this money is going to go to the benefit of the child. And we can also take from this narration that it is a good idea to take preemptive action to avoid any fitna or fasad. Because here, the Prophet did not wait for somebody to break into her house. Rather, he ordered her to move before an event such as this could actually occur. Hadith 968. وعن عمرو بن العاص رضي الله عنه قال: لا تلبسوا علينا سنة نبينا عدة أم الولد إذا توفي عنها سيدها 4 أشهر و10. رواه أحمد وأبو داود وابن ماجه وصححه الحاكم وأعله الدارقطني بالانقطاع. This is a narration from Amr ibn al-As. He says, do not confuse us about the sunnah of our Prophet. The waiting period of the Walad, the mother of the child, if her master dies, is 4 months and 10 days. This narration is Sahih. Hadith 969. وعن عائشة رضي الله عنها قالت: إنما الأقراء الأطهار. أخرجه مالك في قصة بسند صحيح. From Aisha, she says that the aqra, plural of qar, is actually the athhar, the period of purity in between the menstruation. This narration has been graded as Sahih in the Muwatta of Al-Imam Malik. Hadith 970. وعن ابن عمر رضي الله عنهما قال: طلاق الأمة تطليقتان وعدتها حيضتان. رواه الدارقطني وأخرجه مرفوعا وضعف، وأخرجه أبو داود والترمذي وابن ماجه من حديث عائشة وصححه الحاكم وخالفوه فاتفقوا على ضعفه. From Ibn Umar, he says that the divorce of a servant girl is 2 divorces and her iddah period are 2 menstrual cycles. This narration is da'if. So these are 3 narrations which we have quoted from Bulugh al-Maram in this chapter of the iddah. The first narration may well be sahih in terms of its sanad. It is a statement of Amr ibn al-As, and we say this is his ijtihad, as knowledgeable as he was, and it is wrong because the Quran completely contradicts what he's saying. He's saying that the iddah of the Walad, if the master dies, is 4 months and 10 days. But the problem is that the Walad is not a wife. The Walad, or the mother of the child, is simply a servant girl who gives birth to the child of her master, and the situation is that when the master dies, this woman who has given birth to his child will become free. This is the Walad. She is not a wife, she is a servant woman. And the iddah of the 4 months and 10 days applies to wives. Allah Jalla wa Ala says, وَالَّذِينَ يُتَوَفَّوْنَ مِنْكُمْ وَيَذَرُونَ أَزْوَاجًا يَتَرَبَّصْنَ بِأَنفُسِهِنَّ 4 أشهر و10. Those men who die and they leave behind wives, not servant women, wives, then they are to wait for 4 months and 10 days. So we simply say that if a servant woman gives birth to the child of her master, then she simply has to undergo 1 menstrual cycle to ensure she is not pregnant, or if she is pregnant, then we know who the father is. And then after this 1 menstrual cycle, she is free to marry. She does not need to undergo the 4 months and 10 days. So it appears then that Amr ibn al-As is confusing the 2 issues together, the issue of the wife and the issue of the servant woman. They are 2 different people with 2 different rulings. As for the second narration, then we have already spoken about this issue. We say that the aqra is in fact the haydah. And previously we gave evidence from the Quran and from the authentic narration in the Sunan, in which the Prophet said about the mustahada that she does not pray during the days of her iqra, and these are obviously the menstruation days. So the mustahada does not pray and fast in the days of her iqra, meaning the menstruation days. And so we say that this ijtihad of Aisha is wrong, and it does not agree with the authentic evidence from the Prophet and from Allah. As for the third narration, then it is telling us that the divorce of a servant girl, if she is a wife, is 2 divorces. So after the second divorce, she becomes ba'ina. Whereas with a free woman, it is after the third divorce that she becomes a ba'ina. The Zahiriyya say, no, it does not make a difference. As long as a woman is your wife, then she becomes ba'ina after the third divorce. And this is in accordance with the generality of the Quran. Now the Quran does not differentiate between a servant woman and a free woman. And they say that this particular narration is da'if. But if we go by the fact that with a servant it is 2 divorces, then we would say that what matters is the wife. So if the wife is a servant, then she becomes ba'ina after 2 divorces. So even if the husband is a servant, it would not make a difference how many divorces he gives. It depends on the wife then. If she is a servant, she becomes a ba'ina after 2 divorces, and we do not say that if the husband is a servant, then the wife becomes a ba'ina after 2 divorces. No, rather it matters on the freedom of the wife, not of the husband. And some other scholars have said, no, it matters on the freedom of the husband, not that of the wife. But this narration clearly tells us that it matters about the freedom of the wife. So with regards to the divorce of the servant woman, then we do have a difference of opinion. Does she become a ba'ina after 2 divorces or 3 divorces? Some scholars say no, it is 3 divorces just like any other wife, and others say it is after 2 divorces if she is a servant. And of course the third opinion, that it depends on the freedom of the husband, not that of the wife. As for the iddah period of the servant woman, then we have an ijma' reported that it is 2 haydha, so 2 menstrual cycles as opposed to 3 menstrual cycles, which is that of the free woman. And this opinion has also been reported by some of the Sahaba like Umar and Ibn Umar and Ali radiallahu anhum, that the iddah of the divorced servant woman is 2 menstrual cycles as opposed to the 3. So we say that if this ijma' is in fact an ijma', then it is not for us to oppose it. As for the servant woman who does not menstruate, then her iddah period will be half of that of the free woman, and this will be not 2 months, but according to the correct opinion we say it would be 1.5 months. This is half of 3. Because with the months we are able to halve them, but we cannot halve 3 menstrual cycles, because it is not possible to have 1.5 menstrual cycles. Okay, let's take some review questions. So question number 1. Define what al-ihdaad is and make mention of those matters in which she has to refrain from. Question number 2. Can an analogy be made between the ihdaad and the ihram, such that we tell the woman in the ihdaad that you're not allowed to wear the niqab and the gloves? Explain whether this is a valid analogy or not. Question number 3. Explain the general rule about the woman leaving the house by daytime and by nighttime during her ihdaad. Under what conditions can this be done?